Well, it's been a wild week here in Ordure Creek, Wisconsin, my hometown, where the autumn air is fresh and clean, and to inhale it deeply is absolutely rejuvenating. You can physically feel the oxygen saturating your blood as you drink in this crisp Wisconsin autumn air, this air that begins to sweep down on us from the north, that clean Canadian air, carrying flavorful hints of the winter to come. If sparkling spring water were air, this would be it. Sparkling spring air that purifies our skies and sweeps the stink of the foundry from town, sending it down over Wapaka and Fremont so we can have some relief while our neighbors choke on it for a while. And people are out enjoying this distilled air in mild sweater weather, out walking dogs and playing football. The maples, elms, and oaks have blanketed us in their colorful leaves, and so those who remotely care about maintaining their yards are out raking their leaves into big piles, and kids will jump into those huge piles of leaves, scattering their parents' hard work all over the place, and inviting rakes from angry parents across their backsides. Jumping into piles of leaves always looks like so much fun to the kids on TV shows and in the commercials, but those kids never catch the business end of a rake on their asses for jumping into piles, and so the kids of Ordure Creek learn hard lessons about never trusting anything that you see on TV. Tom Behnke has just put up his Joe Biden for President yard sign proudly and prominently in his front yard. A sense of civic duty washes over him with the same electric sensation felt by a deeply religious person in the throes of worship, a sensation bordering on ecstasy. And this sign declares his faith, makes him stand out within this swamp of Trump signs, differentiating himself from the rubes, raising him above the rabble, and marking him as a man of intelligence. To him, this sign is not just a badge of honor, but it's an identity. Now he stands over it proudly, breathing the pure, sparkling Canadian air, observing the neighbors across the street. Al and Lindsay Saunders. Al is sprawled out in a lawn chair, high life in hand, while Lindsay rakes leaves and uses the rake to swat the kids out of her colorful leaf piles. Two little girls, no older than 9 or 10, are chatting happily as they ride their bikes down the sidewalk towards him, and in this moment, Tom thinks never has Ordure Creek seemed more like Mayberry. The quaint tranquility, the simple beauty of it all, and Tom is overcome with a flood of peaceful nostalgia. He is beaming a smile of legitimate joy that so often eludes men of his 60-plus years when bitterness, resentment, and regret take hold of so many his age. But for a moment it all seems so far away in this pure, nostalgic joy. He raises his hand to wave at the two little girls now riding past him, these darling little girls, these princesses of Ordure Creek, and one of these sweet princesses of Ordure Creek responds, "My dad says anyone with one of those signs is a fag." And Tom freezes. He can do nothing but blink as the friendly greeting he begins to utter is brutally slaughtered on his lips. Before he can even process what the hell just happened, the second sweet princess is speaking to him. "My dad says anyone with one of those signs probably wants to sniff my head, and I should stay away from him." They both look at Tom with grossed out looks on their faces. Sweet princess number one asks, "Do you want us to stop so you can sniff our heads?" And they giggle as they ride on, leaving Tom standing there, hand frozen in the air, smile frozen on his face, a momentary fixture in his own yard. He's become a yard gnome. The religious joy he's felt just a moment before is wilted ever so slightly, and he's now reminiscing on his decision to move here so many years ago when he accepted that job at the community college, and wonders why he never left this primitive wasteland, this hovel of human dissipation. He could have gone to the West Coast, where it's warm and where there's culture and progressivism is an accepted way of life. After what seems an eternity of being trapped deep inside his own ruminations, Tom became vaguely aware of his name being called and snaps out of his statuesque pose and back to reality. "Behnke! Hey, Behnke!" his neighbor Al calls to him from across the street. His wife has stopped raking and beating the kids, and they're both looking at him. Tom's smile returns, and he begins waving to them, friendly, neighborly, just like Mayberry, and Al raises his beer in return. "Nice sign," he shouts. Tom's smile widens. Could the Saunders be fellow supporters? That religious joy begins to bubble forth again. "Well, thanks, Al," Tom yells back across the street, and he begins to offer a sign to his neighbor for their own yard, and Al says, You want me to send the kids over later so you can sniff their heads? Al and Lindsay burst out laughing, and Lindsay reaches her rake across to toast Al's beer for a burn well applied, and Tom once more becomes that frozen fixture, that yard gnome, and now he's completely dead inside. Why was he here, living among these ungrateful Neanderthals who have no appreciation for the intelligence and goodwill this sign clearly communicates? Such is the life of a Biden supporter living in Trump country, and Tom has briefly considered not putting up a sign at all, but just briefly. He could never consider not putting up a yard sign. This was, after all, the most important election of our lifetime. Well, at least the most important election of our lifetime since the 2016 election, which was the most important election of our lifetime since the 2012 election, which was the most important election, whatever. This was the one. This was the election that would spell the end of America and usher in the age of fascism if Donald Trump won again. Tom's steady diet of MSNBC and NPR made this a certainty for him that he could feel in his very bones, and he was proud to fight the forces of fascism, so long as the fight only entailed putting out a yard sign and coloring in a circle on a ballot. If fighting fascism ever required some actual work on his part, he'd no doubt have to reconsider his commitment to fighting them, but signs and voting worked out just fine for him. Tom Behnke and his best friend Gary Ostrowski ran the local chapter of the Democratic Party right out of the basement of the Land Grab Realty building on Main Street, a space donated to them by the building's owner, Margie Conley, who, although a Democrat, was a low-key Democrat who wasn't very much involved with the party, being too business savvy to make her political affiliations a center of her identity, as so many others like to do, especially here in Trump country. Unless you knew her personally, you'd never know Margie voted blue, and that's because she liked making money too much to ever be mistaken as a Democrat. The Land Grab Realty basement that served as the Democratic Party headquarters was small, 2 rooms and a bathroom. The larger room is where the meetings were held, and the smaller room was for coffee and snacks for the faithful who actually attended the dry, uneventful meetings, which was usually anywhere from 10 to 20 gray heads who saw the monthly gatherings as more of a social outing, an excuse to get out of the house for the evening rather than any kind of measure of their own political party involvement. Down here, they were tucked away, hidden away from polite society. It's similar to the way that the affluent and powerful families used to do with their retarded or horribly disfigured offspring. Likewise, the Democratic Party is the retarded and deformed offspring of Ordure Creek and shoved away in a musty little corner where no one would be subjected to its horrors. Yet for those who now attended the bland meetings, it held an air of resistance in the age of Trump, and many felt as though they were taking part in clandestine revolutionary activity by being there. When you've retired from some middle-class employment, life becomes painstakingly flexible. While working, your days are plotted out for you. You know exactly what you're going to do day after day. You're going to go to work and eat, watch some TV, go to sleep. On the weekend, it's going to be Packers, Badgers, beer, and yard work. You become content to give up any silly dreams you may have once had to float through a predetermined life. But in retirement, you have to struggle to find things to do. Life becomes a perpetual weekend. Well, this musty basement is one of those things to do. Every second Thursday of the month at 7 p.m., it was time to dress up and go out for dinner and be a part of the great American political process. Or at least sit down here and complain to like-minded, equally bored retirees about the Republicans and Donald Trump over lemon bars and coffee. Unlike the backlash they might get from their families discussing politics during the holidays, this was their safe space, soft bubble where they wouldn't have to worry about their ideas being challenged, a place where they could reaffirm their beliefs about the state of the world and politics, and reaffirm that every single little social problem in every tiny aspect of life was because of the Republicans. But complaining in lemon bars was about as active as most of this party ever got. These retired old big bellies filling up on snacks and belly aching about things far beyond their control. Any of the local events the party may have wanted to have a presence at was manned almost exclusively by Tom, Gary, and 68-year-old Jody Hurish, who was one of those caustic, hateful partisans that Tom and Gary really didn't want around at all, but when you're a Democrat in Ordure Creek, you take what you can get. Well, tonight's meeting proceeded as usual. Tom called the meeting to order, and they went over the party's expenses and asked for volunteers to help with the Democratic booth at the Agabraten Harvest Festival in a week. As usual, Jody Hirsch immediately signed up, licking her lips at the prospect of getting to put those evil, racist right-wingers in their place every chance she got, and as usual, there would be no other takers from the more, shall we say, less unhinged members of the party. Showing your face in the safety of these meetings was one thing, but to show your face to a hostile public was quite another, and nobody was really interested in doing that except for Jody. Little did anybody know that this was going to be one of those magical evenings. When about a half hour into it, two newcomers entered and found some seats in the back as quietly as they could, but of course not quietly enough. The meeting came to a halt as 22 gray heads simultaneously turned around to gawk at the new arrivals. They appeared to be school kids, a girl with purple hair and several piercings, and a tall, lanky boy in all black with hair bordering on greasy. And all they could do was kind of wave at the 43 wide eyes gawking at them. And no, my math isn't wrong. Arlo Fansky has one glass eye, hence the odd number of eyes. And one thought ran through the minds of those in the party. Could this be young people? Few had ever seen such a thing at a party before. What could this mean? And all they could do was gape stupidly at the kids until Tom broke the stunned silence by welcoming them and asking them to introduce themselves. Kendra Marie and Jason Peterson were sophomores at the local high school, the Ordure Creek Learnin' Center. Yes, the Ordure Creek Learnin' Center, not the Ordure Creek Learning Center. It was the Learning Center until we lost the G in the tornado of 2011, and budgets being as tight as they were for school districts, it was decided by the school board that it would be cheaper to replace the lost G with an apostrophe. It was quite a debate for a while, but the apostrophe solution was the one that won out in the end, and since then we've had the Ordure Creek Learnin' Center. Kendra and Jason were outcasts who took refuge in the high-minded sounding political thought of Bernie Sanders, at least what high school kids consider to be high-minded political thought. And as high-minded high school outcasts do, they formed utopian political opinions and grew loathsome of the petty drama of their peers who were clearly too self-absorbed to understand the importance of their opinions. Naturally, this sneering attitude of self-righteousness only isolates them even more from their peers, but the sneering attitude of self-righteousness would be the perfect fit here in the Democratic Party. After some introductions and discussion, it was learned that there were a few others from the Learnin' Center who would also be interested in helping out, and understandably, Tom and Gary were more than delighted to be tasked with raising up the next generation of progressive political activists. A special meeting was scheduled with the kids for that Saturday, and Kendra and Jason did not disappoint. They recruited 7 other kids from their elite friends circle with promises that they would be manning the front lines in the fight to topple the evil Trump regime. In the 20 years that Tom and Gary had served as chair and vice chair of the Ordure Creek Democratic Party, they had never seen so many people in one place ready to take action on the party's behalf. Hell, they had been chair and vice chair for 20 years because they couldn't even get people to volunteer for officer positions. Tom and Gary had switched off the positions every term just to try and mix things up a bit and try to make things somewhat more interesting. Tom happened to be chair right now, and next term it would very likely be Gary, and that would literally be the most exciting thing that happened within the party in 2 years. But not anymore. This group of eager and energetic foot soldiers was the most exciting thing that had happened to the party in a very long time, since the election of Barack Obama in 2008, while most of these kids were barely starting school. Tom and Gary knew that they couldn't let this opportunity slip away and had to instill in these kids the absolute history-making importance of this election. So they told the kids of this evil, corrupt organization that was bent on destroying everything good in America. This organization wanted poor people to die because they couldn't afford health care, and they wanted to take money from the working class to give to large corporations and turn beautiful rainforests into ash and pump pollution into our skies that would cause environmental catastrophes so vast the death tolls would be staggering. The kids learned of this diabolical organization's callous disregard for human rights and human dignity, tales of locking immigrant children in cages and denying transgendered people their own bathrooms, and this evil organization was known as the Republican Party. On and on they weaved a tale of environmental horrors and a dark dystopian future, this utterly nightmarish hellscape of death and oppression that would befall them should Trump win re-election. And the children sat with wide-eyed dismay as they drank in every word. They had no idea it was this bad. Yes, it was this bad. The authoritarians wanted to take everything from them. They were colonizers who wanted to conquer every aspect of their lives. Wow, the kids thought. Colonizers. What a word. After the kids left the meeting, they were soon using this as a term of derision towards every authority figure in their lives, their parents and teachers and other kids at school who disagreed with them. They were very outspoken about their opposition to the evil colonizers. The kids refused to attend school on the 12th because it was Columbus Day, and they'd be damned if they were going to acknowledge any celebration of a dirty colonizer. Well, the first plan of action handed down from Tom and Gary was door knocking and lit dropping. According to them, this is how grassroots campaigning is done. You go straight to the people with the message of hope and salvation that was offered by Joe Biden. And after a long day of this, they'd be rewarded with a pizza party back at the HQ. The kids were psyched to hit the streets that Sunday, ready to change hearts and mind for Biden, to do their part to save America, and by the end of the day, they were angrily munching on their pizza with story after story of having doors slammed in their faces and being told to buzz off and that they were just dumb kids who didn't know shit about shit, and have their candidate called all kinds of names, this beautiful man who just wanted nothing more than to save America, this political Jesus, and they called him a pedophile and a looter and a racist and said he had dementia and wasn't right in the head, all kinds of things. And that's how the kids were introduced to the world of politics. After this first outing, they were depressed and defeated, but they were also hungry and inhaled one pizza after another while they wallowed in their misery. How can people hate the promises of the Democratic Party so much? The idea that we should care for and help one another. How could there be so many colonizers? What happened? Was everybody just completely brainwashed and stupid? The answer from Tom and Gary was yes. Yes, people are brainwashed and stupid. They've been brainwashed by their capitalist system to reject their fellow man for profit, and the Democratic Party was the resistance, the last bastion of hope for humanity. The answer was to hit the streets harder next weekend, cover more ground, talk to more people, for only the Democratic Party stood between freedom and neo-feudalism. Wow, neo-feudalism. What a word. And soon the kids were using that everywhere, in school, at home, in book reports. Allie Swenson used it in her book report on To Kill a Mockingbird. It wasn't actually so much a book report on To Kill a Mockingbird as it was a report condemning colonizers and neo-feudalists. These big, cool, new terms that they were learning from their involvement with the Democratic Party gave them all a very self-aggrandizing sense of their own intelligence, which to them further separated they, the resistors, from the sea of colonizers. And the next Saturday, they redoubled their efforts. After staying up all night the night before, smoking pot and hopped up on energy drinks, discussing the evils of capitalism and the oppressive Trump administration, they had hit the streets at 8 a.m. sharp to ensure a full day of spreading the gospel of the Democratic Party. Predictably, the day got off to an even worse start than it had last weekend, with half the town being hungover. The last thing anybody wanted that early in the morning was to be greeted by a dumb high school kid talking to them about the politics they were already sick and tired of fucking hearing about. By noon, they had given up and decided it wasn't working at all. Kendra called a meeting on her own without Tom and Gary to announce that clearly the old ways of doing politics was not the best way to fight the new revolution. Something else needed to be done. More drastic measures needed to be taken. And they went to work discussing what to do and looking to the internet for inspiration. It was around 7:30 Sunday morning, and Tom was settling in with a freshly made cup of coffee to watch some MSNBC and find out what new outrage the Trump administration and the Republicans had engaged in now. And that's when he got a call from Chief Callum. It appears that overnight, nearly every political sign bearing the name of any Republican candidate was either spray painted, stolen, or destroyed. Several smaller yard signs were found in the river, and several of the larger wooden ones were burned to piles of ash. Calls were flooding in all over town, and while political campaigns had been somewhat contentious in the past, the Ordure Creek PD had never seen anything like this before. It was a complete extermination of Republican Party campaign signs, and people were pissed. So Tom, the chief, asked, "Do you know anything about this?" Tom stuttered and stammered, grasping for any answer that he could cling to while insisting he had no idea what happened. Of course, he knew exactly what had happened. What he and Gary had intended to do was expand the party and give a show of support for Joe Biden in the heart of Trump country. What they had unwittingly done was start a cult. And that's the news from Ordure Creek, Wisconsin this week, where the beer is thick, the cheese is fresh, and the Packers are above average. If you're enjoying this podcast, share it with the ones you love. Don't keep good things to yourself. Let others know about it. If you really enjoy this podcast, give it a thumbs up on the Facebook page at Dairy State Pub Crawl. If you really, really love this podcast, consider throwing a buck or two into my beggar's cup over at patreon.com/dairystate and get some access to some sweet bonus features. Yeah, as soon as I put some up.